Kevin Magee. I'm a member of CLUE, the Cleveland Underwater Explorers, and tonight I'm going to talk to you about the Plymouth, which was a schooner that sank in Lake Erie. And we're going to learn a little bit about it, what it looks like, and how it got there. And the story behind it is actually pretty good. It's not just your classic shipwreck sinking story. As I was saying earlier, I may be the person up here speaking, but really this is a group effort. CLUE is a group of people that have interest in Great Lakes history, maritime traditions, shipwrecks in particular. Dave Van Zandt and I co-founded the group in 2001, and we've been finding shipwrecks ever since then. The count now is about 40, and other people in the group are Jim Paskert, who's our chief researcher, Tom Kowalczyk, who's our western searcher. He finds all the shipwrecks in the western basin. And of course, Cindy LaRosa is here tonight, is one of our survey divers, and also oral history person. So, what is CLUE a little bit more specifically? We're a nonprofit corporation. We're a certified nonprofit. And what we do, our purpose is to research, locate, explore, and document shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. With an emphasis on Lake Erie, because that's where we live. In order to do this, you really need a lot of talents. And I think you'll see as I go through this talk that it's not just you get in a boat, go out, find a shipwreck, and dive in. There's much more to it than that. Dave Van Zandt is a nuclear engineer by training, but he actually went back to school and got a degree in maritime archaeology. So he's actually an archaeologist as well now. Both Dave, Tom, and Jim Paskert are all experts in archival research. All of us know a lot about maritime history, underwater surveying and search techniques. That means using side scans, magnetometers, how to lay a baseline, take measurements, measure a shipwreck, document the shipwreck. And of course, I'm a mechanical engineer. So my daytime job, I do aerospace type work. Dave does the same. And by night, as a hobby, we find shipwrecks, at least during the summer. We're also, some of us are technical divers. What does that mean? Technical divers dive funny mixes like helium and can go deep up to 200, 300 foot. Cindy is a technical diver, I'm a technical diver, and Dave Van Zandt's a technical diver. And we have surveyed shipwrecks up for CLUE up to 145 foot deep, which is a little bit beyond the recreational range at 130. And I've personally surveyed shipwrecks up to 185 feet deep in Lake Erie. So there's a lot of skills that go into doing shipwreck searching and things like that. So the best place to start with any story is the beginning. So let's start there. So back in 1996, Rob Richley, who wasn't a CLUE member at the time, but he is now, was out searching in Lake Erie, and he found a shipwreck, right where that yellow dot is. And that little shipwreck was about 20 miles off of Cleveland, in 75 feet of water, which is about as deep as it gets for that part of Lake Erie. It doesn't get much deeper than that. And when he dove it, what he found was a wonderful, well-preserved, two-masted schooner. It was tiller steered, and that's what you're seeing there. Everybody thinks ships were steered by wheels. That did not happen until the 1850s and 60s. Before that, even large ships were steered by tillers. I can imagine standing on the deck trying to turn a 150-foot ship by a tiller. That's exactly what they did. It's an 8-foot, 3-inch long tiller for the ship. Based on the style of construction, the equipment aboard, it was a mid-1800s type vessel. And Rob actually kept it a secret and sat on it for almost 14 years. Just kind of his own personal record. But eventually it was revealed. In the fall of 2010, other people got a hold of the coordinates and announced it. And they called it the Cleveland Tiller Rig. The next year, 2011, they actually published the coordinates, allowing everybody to go to it, and they identified it as the schooner Mackinaw, based on what they thought. So that's normally where the story would end. Somebody finds a shipwreck, somebody announces it, another group announces it, another group publishes the coordinates, and it's open to the public. CLUE took a very different reason to look into this wreck. And it has to do with this shipwreck. This is the buried schooner. Now, we had found this shipwreck back in September 2007, 3 years before all this happened. And as you can tell, it's mostly buried. In fact, so buried that there's really almost nothing we can do to try to identify it. Everybody thinks ships sink with bells with names on it and names carved on the side. That's not the way it works. If there's even a bell, it's usually a cast iron farm bell type thing, got a Sears catalog. no names on it. Very rare to find a bell with a name on it. And name boards are, if they do exist, which are rare, they're painted on, the paint's long gone. So you don't find names on these things. This is all we had to work with, and that's true with most shipwrecks. This is what you got to work with, the ship itself. It was located 20, 25 miles off of Cleveland, pretty close to where the Cleveland tiller wreck is, which piqued our interest. And it was old. The style of construction, the style of the 90-degree davits, the bowsprit, and the windlass that was exposed, plus the dead eyes on the railings. We could tell it was a two-masted schooner. Early to mid-1800s construction, and that's about all we could say about it. We really couldn't do anything more with it. We couldn't even measure its length and width because, well, it's buried. We thought it might be the Plymouth, based on our research. Actually, I should say Jim Paskert's research. Based on where it was and what it was, we could have guessed maybe it was the Plymouth. So when the Cleveland tiller wreck was announced, that kind of caught our interest. And then when it was called the Mackinaw, it really got our interest because we had a problem with that. Based on our archival research, the Mackinaw was only 10 miles offshore, not double the distance at 20. So immediately we thought that doesn't sound right. We don't really think that could be the Mackinaw based on our research. And so the question became, what is the Cleveland tiller wreck? Is it really the Mackinaw? Did we not have enough information about the Mackinaw and what we did have was wrong? Or could it be the Plymouth? Or is it yet another vessel? Well, the Cleveland tiller wreck was a lot easier to survey. It stands about 5, 6 foot off the bottom. It's fully exposed. This is a type of ship you can do a lot of work with. And we thought if we could make a positive identification on the Cleveland tiller wreck, we'd at least be able to tell what the buried schooner was not. We'd be able to eliminate one from the list. So that's why we got interested. And so we do what we do best. And back in July of 2013, we went out and surveyed the ship. This is actually the real survey. We do underwater paper and I draw on it. And this is all the measurements and the raw stuff that we took to try to create what this ship looks like, its dimensions, and special features about it. We did a side scan survey, we did measurements, we did video, photography, the whole bit, which is what we usually do to document a wreck. We returned again for 2 other times, in August of that year and then June of the next year, to obtain even more information about it. Additional data, additional photos, go back and measure a few other things. And the hope is that this would provide solid enough evidence for us to ID the wreck. So let's take a look at what we found. This is what the wreck looks like. This is a side scan image of it. Just think of it as an overhead aerial photograph taken of the lake bottom, but it's taken with sound instead of light. And so you're just kind of looking at the bow. Here's the railings. You can see the transom and open end. You can kind of see where there's some decking here, here. And it all looks very nice. This is the ultimate sketch that we came up with based on all the measurements. This is kind of the pretty picture of it. And you can see here's the tiller at the stern. We've got all the deck equipment running up in there. And then we got the bow up here. The bow actually is really cool because it has a very old style cutwater with headrails, broken bowsprit, you can see, and a curious notch in the cutwater. So let's take a look at that. So this is looking up here at the bow of the ship. This is looking at it from head on. So this is actually the cutwater right here. Those are the headrails, and there's the broken bowsprit. And this is that notch. And that notch actually piqued our interest. And the reason it piqued our interest is because we've seen this before. If you look at other ships, you actually get a really good idea of whatever's missing on the ship you have, what might really be there. And you can see that this shipwreck, this is called Schooner G. It's an unidentified ship in eastern Lake Erie. It's about 165 feet of water. And it has a beautiful exposed cutwater, these 2 little decorative carving lines, the headrails, and where that notch is, a beautiful scroll head. And if you look closely, you can actually see the join lines. They carved that separately and then stuck it on. And that's a scroll head. And by the way, that's pretty unique in the sense that not every ship came with a figurehead. Again, one of those misconceptions, all ships have figurehead and scroll heads. Actually really rare for Great Lakes. Scroll heads are more common than figureheads. Figureheads, I think I could count only 10 that are even known in all of the Great Lakes. So just having a scroll head is unique. It's actually a really characteristic thing. And it's on the enrollment papers. They actually say plain head, it means nothing, that's the vast majority. scrollhead, which was pretty common for earlier ships, not so much later, and figurehead, which is really rare. And all that's listed on the enrollment papers. So based on this, we thought, aha, that notch that we see here, there was something there. We can't say what. It was either a scrollhead or a figurehead, but it certainly wasn't a plane head. Going down the ship, here's the windlass. The windlass is a big horizontal winch that's used to raise and lower the anchors. All done manually, with two guys sitting there with either posts or cranking a ratchet. This is the pawl and the pawl bit that would have done that, about a couple inches every motion. And here's the anchor chain, still wrapped around on both sides on the pawl bit, or on the windlass spool. The ball bit, the carrot bits, anchor chain, and the spool, all there nice together. And in fact, there's an anchor hanging off of the starboard bow. The port one's missing, along with its cathead. Probably fell off when it sank. One of the really diagnostic features that we noticed immediately on this wreck was this huge gash in the side of the ship. And I mean gash. I mean, it looks like a knife cut right through it. Most ships, when they collide, this would be what we would call a collision hole. Most of them, it's just a wedge, a chunk that's taken out of it. This thing is different. Not only did it obliterate the side, there's this jagged, you can actually see the boards. Yeah, there's a jagged cut that just extends right through the middle of the ship, beyond the centerboard, damaging the centerboard, and almost to the other side. It's like a knife cut, this thing. That's a really unusual feature. That's a collision hole for sure. And it's not like a normal collision hole, which was usually a wedge, a shape of a bow that bumped into it. So, unusual and interesting. Down here at the center of the ship, the decking is intact. This is called the Centerboard Winch. So these things had drop-down keels. When they got out in deep water, they'd drop down keels. And then when they got in shallow water, they'd use this winch to pull it up into the centerboard box so that they could come into harbors and things like that. But being a sailing vessel, they need a keel so they don't go sideways in the wind. You can see part of the top of the box here in the collision hole, and the dock box is damaged. This is the winch that would have had the chain going down to the rear of the box, and they would just pull that thing right on in because the pivot was up at the front of the box. And attached to it at the rear was a single hand pump. You can see the rod going down to the piston. This is the handle. And there was actually a really unusual drainage trough that went to the hole in the centerboard. Because remember, the centerboard actually empties to the bottom of the ship. So rather than dump the water on the deck, it dumped it down that hole. More expedient way of getting it back into the water where it belongs and off your deck and out of your hold. By the way, preservation is so good that if you look down this hole, you can actually see the leather flapper still down there on top of the piston, which is really cool. Just behind it is the broken mainmast, shattered. You see just a stub sitting up. And for those who are wondering, this is actually our grapple from the boat. That's not part of the equipment of the ship. And of course, finally at the stern is the tiller. So this is what the ship looks like. And this is a classic early, middle 1800s build style. The equipment, the windlass, the pump, everything says early, middle 1800s, which is rare. Shipping was just starting in the Great Lakes. This was would have been one of the bigger vessels at the time, for the most part, doing cargo. So I'm an engineer, and by law, I have to put at least one table or figure into my presentation. So bear with me on this. It's actually not that big. So this is how we identify shipwrecks. You take everything you've gotten, and you compare it to your candidates. So here's the Mackinaw, here's the Plymouth, here's what we actually measured. The Mackinaw had dimensions of roughly 113 feet long by 23 foot beam. The Plymouth was smaller, around 106 foot by 23 beam. We measured 107, plus 0, minus 5. And I'll get back to why I know that number, that inaccuracy, that tolerance. But you can see the measurements certainly match a little better there. Two-masted schooner, straight across the board, yep, they're all matching there. The Mackinaw had a plane head. Remember I was talking about that? It had no scroll head or figurehead, just a plane head. We know that from the enrollment papers. The Plymouth, historically, according to its enrollment, had a scroll head. Now, we don't know what was there. It was either a scroll head or figurehead, but it certainly wasn't a plane head. So that's a checkbox for the Plymouth. Grain, both ships were carrying grain. We did not go burrowing into the silt at the bottom of the hole to see what was down there. You probably have to get a tube and get down there and sample it. We didn't really feel like that was necessary. Technically, we need a permit to do things like that anyway. So we try not to do destructive type testing or things where we actually have to take a sample. The damage. The Mackinaw did sink in a collision, but nobody has ever found any information about the details. What side, fore, aft, nothing. We actually have pretty good information on the Plymouth. We know it was on the starboard side, amidships, at a right angle, and the stem of the ship that hit it drove nearly to the center of the deck by descriptions. Well, that certainly sounds pretty much like what we have. Starboard side, it's 10 foot forward of amidships, but pretty close to amidships, right angle, and it's a knife-like cut straight across the deck. Further than middle, almost all the way to the other side. And location. Mackinaw, 10 miles off of Cleveland versus the 20 for the Plymouth, and the Cleveland Shipwreck is 21.8 miles off of Cleveland. So, what do you think it might be? So, let's go back over that real quick. First of all, regardless of whether we think it's the Plymouth or not, I can say absolutely it cannot be the Mackinaw. And this is why. The tiller wreck is just too short. Remember I measured 107 foot? Well, that's done with a tape measure. So you take a tape measure and you run it down the length of the wreck. You know what happens with tape measures? They sag. You got to go around mast stubs and equipment. You always end up measuring longer than what the actual ship is. And I've learned through experience and trial and error that generally speaking, you can have up to 1 foot of error for every 25 foot of length. That's kind of the outside bounds, the worst you could do if you try to pull it tight and do the best job you can. So, the Mackinaw is 113 feet long. We measured 107. You always measure longer than what the ship actually is. Plus, ships, when they sink, kind of relax. They spread out a little bit more. If we're measuring 107 foot, and that's still 7 foot short of the 113 of the Mackinaw, perfect condition, there's no way it could be the Mackinaw. I mean, yes, it's only 7 foot, but it's in the wrong direction. It's too short. Or you always measure longer. I should be measuring 113 plus 5 foot or so. So I can say absolutely sure that it's not the Mackinaw based solely on the measurements. I could also say that, again, there's something there, scroll head or figurehead, not a plane head, and it's just in the wrong location. They're all, when they tell where they sank, they say 10 or 15 miles. And they're off by 3-5 miles. But to be off by double the distance, they never were that bad, unless they're hiding something. And nobody was hiding anything on this one. So I can say it's not the Mackinaw. Now the Plymouth. The Plymouth, length is 106. We actually measured 107. I thought we'd measure by the tolerances, 106 to 111. We did pretty good. We're only a foot over. That's actually almost spot on. Scroll head, right location, and the collision damage is unique. And actually, this to me is the thing that tells us for sure we have the Plymouth. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But this to me is the cincher, the spike in the heart of the matter. So this is the Plymouth. We now know what the Cleveland Shipwreck is. It is for sure the Plymouth. So what did the Plymouth look like, and how did it get there? So let's talk a little bit about its history. Now, there's no actual photographs of the Plymouth. It was way too early. It was built in 1847 in Huron, Ohio. Most people don't know it, but Huron used to be a major shipbuilding center. Its dimensions, we've talked about that, it carry almost 200 tons. Big for a vessel of that day. Two-masted. This is a representative schooner, the Duval. Pretty close. The bow's all wrong. It's not the right bow, but that's okay. Good enough. Gets you the idea. So how did it get there in the middle of Lake Erie? Well, for that, you have to go to about 5 years after it was built. And you have to go to an early spring night, June 23rd, 1852. This is long before the Civil War, almost 10 years before the Civil War. At 1 in the morning, it was sailing from Huron, where it was built and operated, carrying a load of grain to Buffalo, which was a pretty normal thing to do. And out of the darkness came the side paddle wheel steamer Northern Indiana, and it just smacked right into the Plymouth. And I'll say that steamer was going really fast. It was going 17 miles an hour. That is blistering fast for that day and age. Most side-built steamers only did up to 12 miles an hour. This thing was doing 17. This thing was a Greyhound. It was a high-speed passenger liner built for speed. And this thing just smacked right into it. And at the time, the Plymouth was on a port tack. For you sailors, that means, of course, you're heeled down to the starboard side. The starboard side's low in the water, port side's high. So when the ship hit, it just came there and rode right up the deck. And it nearly cut the Plymouth in half. You can actually see the accounts of the day in the newspapers. It said the schooner was struck on her starboard side about midship and nearly at a right angle. The stem of the steamer was driven nearly to the center of the deck of the schooner, which soon sank, and the schooner and cargo were a total loss. So there you go. This is, to me, why I think this is the Plymouth. This is a really unique collision feature. And this, to me, is what really tells us it's the Plymouth, more than anything else, which is admittedly circumstantial. Remember that hole? That's that high-speed steamer smacking into it at 17 miles an hour. And nothing can do damage like a side paddle steamer doing that. So this, to me, is the real clincher on why it is for sure the Plymouth. Now, fortunately, there were no lives lost, which is very fortunate. There were 10 people aboard the schooner, and it went down in 8 minutes. For the first 2 minutes, the two ships were locked together. And the captain and 2 other crew actually just stepped aboard the Northern Indiana to save themselves. The rest of the crew and the 2 passengers that are aboard went into the ship's yawl, which hangs off the stern, and was lowered and got away before the ship sank in 8 minutes. After 2 minutes, they pulled out. Water then started gushing in through that massive hole, and 8 minutes later, the schooner went down. Fortunately, Northern Indiana picked up the people in the boat. 3 people had already hopped aboard, and that was very fortunate. I might point out, by the way, that the mate, John Wilson, he had his wife, Mrs. John Wilson, and a child, 7 months old aboard. So it wasn't unusual to travel with your family in those days. And if the boat goes down, everybody goes down. So it was very fortunate that no lives were lost. But they weren't out of trouble yet. And the reason is the Northern Indiana almost sank. So it split its bow open. Water's now pouring into the Northern Indiana. So rather than continue upbound to the other end of Lake Erie like they were planning, they instead turned south and headed for Cleveland as fast as they could. And when they arrived in Cleveland, they had 3 to 4 foot of water in their hold, and they were very close to sinking themselves. You can actually see the description here. The steamer suffered so seriously in the collision as to render it doubtful whether she would ever reach the shore. By immense exertion, however, she was brought into Cleveland about daylight, when another hour out would have certainly sent her down to keep company with the lackless schooner. So it was a close call. I mean, a lot of people could have died. And this is why this is so curious. Look at the paragraph right above the one I just showed you. It's talking about a novel incident, an exciting piece of byplay. That's kind of weird. In fact, the press, very lightheartedly, despite these dire things about both ships almost sinking, actually treat it really lightheartedly, like it's no big deal. That's a really curious reaction. Let's read the paragraph above. In the course of the night, the gallant steamer afforded a novel incident to its passengers by running into and sinking a laden schooner bound for Buffalo from Toledo. Actually, it was from Huron. As the crew of the wreck was saved, nobody allowed himself to be otherwise than amused by this exciting piece of byplay. Isn't that weird? And when we saw it, we're like, well, what's going on there? That doesn't seem to make sense. Especially when you read down here. There were already 4 feet of water in the hole, and in spite of the utmost urgency or activity on the pumps, she was filling so rapidly that in a matter of moments longer, the fires would have been extinguished and the vessel would have been lost. What a contrast. I mean, 1 minute it's dire, the next minute, exciting piece of byplay. So what's going on here? Well, let's take a look at the Northern Indiana. This is the Northern Indiana. As I said, it's a large side paddle wheel steamer. 2 paddle wheels, 1 on each side, big walking beam engine. And it was built March of 1852, just 3 months prior to the accident. It was built and operated out of Buffalo, and it was huge. 300 foot long. This is massive. Most ships were only 150 foot long. This was double the size. 1,500 tons. That's almost 8 times more than what the Plymouth is rated to carry. And this thing was custom built to be a passenger steamer. And it was powerful. 38 foot diameter wheels, the side paddle wheels. Narrow too, only 36 foot beam, even though it's 300 foot long. This thing's like a dart. And it had a top speed of 18 miles an hour. It was traveling almost full speed when it had the collision. So let's look at that bow. So there's the bow. And if you look at other side paddle wheel steamers available today, of kind of the same size and class, this is the Ticonderoga, which is up in Lake Champlain. It was a ferry at one time, now it's a museum on shore. This is the exact same type of bow that would have hit the Plymouth. Now, you can see how sharply raked it is, how cut it is. But what I think you need to do is look at it from straight on. That's what it looks like. It's a knife. This is the knife that sank the Plymouth. And again, to me, it's the collision hole that really nails this as the Plymouth. There could be no other ship that it could be. So who owned the Northern Indiana? Well, first of all, she had a sister ship, the Southern Michigan, and their owners were the Michigan Southern Railroad. Well, that's curious. Why is a railroad operating a ship? Railroads did operate ships, but they were car ferries. They put railroad cars on them and shuttle them from one side of the lake to the other, take a shortcut essentially. But they're running a passenger ferry, a high-speed luxury passenger liner. Why would they be doing that? Well, let's take a look at where it was going. Where did it come from? Where was it going? It had left Dunkirk and was actually headed down the lake, upbound. It's going to make the middle passage between Kelly's and Pelee, and was headed to Monroe, Michigan, which is a curious destination, not a major port normally. And the newspaper accounts described it as a pleasure excursion. In fact, the reason there's so many paper clippings about it is because there was a bunch of journalists aboard from Chicago and from New York. And they all reported on the collision, so we have lots of information. There were 400 to 500 dignitaries and their families aboard. It was described as a shareholders cruise, and what this was the start of a rail connection between New York City and Chicago. The railroad would take people to Dunkirk, they get on a boat, go down the length of Lake Erie, get off at Monroe, get back on a railroad, and go all the way to Chicago. And this was the start of what was called the Michigan Southern, Northern Indiana, and New York and Erie Railroad. And this was going to start regular service. This was the inaugural run with all the important people. So let's take a look at that New York and Erie Railroad. So how did it get to Dunkirk? So it's obviously a New York railroad, and you have to remember the politics of the time. New York did not want competition from Boston or Philadelphia as a port. They wanted everything to flow through New York City. So when this, and of course being a railroad, you have to get a charter from the government. Well, they were told, you cannot connect to any other railroad going to any other state, i.e. any other port. So they actually made sure they didn't do it by using a non-standard 6-foot heavy gauge instead of the standard 4-foot 8.5-inch gauge. So they weren't going to match railroads, even if they tried. And of course they were banned from connecting to any other railroads, but nobody said about connecting to a ship. And that's what they did. They built their railroad lines connecting with Lake Ontario, Lake Erie, and the final spur to be completed was right to Dunkirk. And that whole point was to get people to Dunkirk, to put them on a boat, so they could run down the lake, because at the time there were no connecting rails along the southern part of Lake Erie, and at the time they also weren't allowed to. That changed later. A lot of political pressure to change it. And they would get off at Monroe. And then they would travel by the Southern Michigan Railroad and the Northern Indiana Railroad all the way to Chicago. Very nice and easy. And in fact, this whole thing had been put together by a bunch of wealthy businessmen from Chicago to make this rail connection happen. And of course, there are people in New York that wanted to see it happen too. And so they actually gained control of all these railroads, put them together, and started a steamship service with the sole purpose of shuttling people back and forth between the railheads. They also did go to Toledo a little bit, and also to Buffalo for side excursions. But this was the whole point. And this is where the Northern Indiana was headed. And in fact, it did make it there. A day late, because they had to do a day's repair in Cleveland, but they weren't about to stop this inaugural thing. They did a quick repair job, got them to Monroe, put them on a train a day late. Apparently there was some people are upset because all along here, every stop, there were bands waiting, parties, dignitary speeches. It was a real party. And of course, this is filled with the dignitaries, politicians, wealthiest, most influential people of both New York City and Chicago. And this explains why the newspaper was so giddy about it. They're not going to let a little accident like this that almost killed everybody stop the party. That wasn't the point of this trip. This was to advertise and make it look good. And everybody's going to have a good time, whether you want to or not. And that's why it's an exciting piece of byplay. Because this is important. As a side note, Think how different history might have been if the Northern Indiana had sunk. Think of all the wealthy people it took with it, the politicians, the movers and shakers, and their families, all gone. That would have been interesting. I wonder what the political repercussions of that would have been. It's one of those alternative histories you could get way deep into. Nevertheless, it was a party, and they made it there. And like I was saying, these side paddle wheels, steamers, were built explicitly for the railroads to connect the railheads. And because of that, they were luxurious. They were decked out to the maximum, and they were designed for speed and comfort. And their only intended service time was until the railroads be connected through the southern part of Lake Erie, and then they wouldn't be needed. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. Both ships were built in 1852. The Northern Indiana actually burned and sank off of Point Pelee in 1856. It only lasted 4 years. It had a collision in the first 3 months of service, lasted another 4 years, and burned and sank. Its sister ship, the Southern Michigan, didn't do much better. It only lasted another couple of years, 1858, and it was laid up in Buffalo and eventually scrapped. These ships, these beautiful, wonderful, fast ships, didn't even serve 10 years. They lasted 6 years at most. And that was it. Their purpose was done. They threw them away. They didn't need them anymore, despite the enormous investment of money and time and effort in them. It's kind of sad. So you might ask, why did this collision happen? I mean, if you read the accounts, the accident did not need to happen. So the wind was blowing very heavy at the time of the accident, as it had during the passage, but the sky was clear and both the vessels had lights on at the time. The accident is unaccountable. How did it happen? Well, I know the owners of the Plymouth and the cargo were really upset about it because they just lost their livelihoods. The vessel that carried it plus their cargoes. And usually there were two separate insurances. One's for the ship, one's for the cargo. And in this case, the ship was insured for $8,000. Its wheat cargo was for $8,400, Buffalo Mutual Insurance Company, and people want their money back, especially since it seems that the railroad was at fault here. So they did exactly what would happen today. They took them to court. They ended up taking the railroad, both the owners of the cargo and the ship took the railroad to court. And this is actually why we have so much good information about the accident. It's all written down in court records. We have the final judgments and all that stuff. And this is a sort of source that you can, this is like gold, because these are sworn testimonies. You're not supposed to lie in these, and there's usually no good reason to lie. You want to tell the truth as much as it makes you look good anyway. And because of that, we get really good information on the accident, where the ships were supposed to be, and by the way, it's really close to where it's supposed to be, and of course, all the damage that happened to the schooner. So there's so much good detail about it. And here's the curious thing. So the railroads were very, very rich. They had the best, highly skilled lawyers available to them. And by the way, that money, that $8,000 for the cargo and one for the ship, $16,000 total, petty cash for them. They could have just paid them off. They didn't. They went to court on a very, very poor case. And they pushed their position. And that's kind of weird. Why would a team of highly skilled lawyers take such a bad case and push so hard when they could have just settled? So at first they claimed that the schooner was not displaying its lights. And the judge said, haha, no. The steamer's own crew testified they saw the schooner's light way before the collision. So that didn't hold. Then they claimed, well, the schooner did not change course in time to prevent a collision. Well, the laws back then were the same now. The sailing vessel doesn't change course. The steamer does. And the judge, of course, pointed that out. The steamer, not the sailing vessel, was required to change course. You should have done it, not the Plymouth. So seeing that they weren't winning that type of argument, they decided instead to go back and say it was an unavoidable accident, and that there was no liability on their part. That was their new tact. And they made the following arguments. They said that the steamer had a proper lookout with its second mate in the wheelhouse, who was in charge at the time of the accident. And the judge rightly pointed out that the second mate's own testimony said that when he saw lights, he had to step out of the wheelhouse to get a good look and see what was going on. That's not a good lookout. Your lookout's supposed to be outside looking in good view, not inside. And admittedly, it was a cold night, but you should have been outside. You should have been inside. So that's not a good lookout. You're not really helping yourself there. And then they made another argument. They claimed that they were traveling fast despite the dark and stormy conditions, because they're carrying U.S. mail, you know, through the gloom of night and all that. And they could be subject to penalties if they were late. And that's really weird. The judge, of course, said that still doesn't override safety considerations. And his final judgment was, if, as contended on the part of the claimants, that the night was so dark and the haze so thick as to prevent those on board of the steamer from seeing the schooner in time to avoid a collision, the speed of 17 miles an hour maintained by the steamer was wholly unjustifiable and rendered her liable for all damages occasioned by the collision. In other words, you lose the case. But this is a really weird claim to make. Why would they do that? That's a really weird stance to take. I mean, that's not one of the legal defenses I would come up with anyway, so why would they do this? So maybe the railroads were up to something else. So, first of all, why did they even take it to court? Like I said earlier, it made no sense. They were in a bad position starting out. And you gotta remember, this is a team of high-end lawyers working for one of the richest companies in the world. And they're taking a bad legal position on a bad case, and they're making these really silly arguments. Why would they be doing this? So maybe they were trying to set a legal precedence. It's worth a shot. All we got to do is, they're already on retainer. We might as well pay them to do something. Or maybe there was something about the judge. So this is the judge. This is Nathan Hall, distinguished gentleman there. And maybe there was something about the judge. Maybe they thought he was beholden to them in some way. Maybe they had power over him, they thought. Maybe they thought he was an idiot they could just push around. He's not too bright. So in other words, were they trying to railroad him? Pun intended. So let's look at Judge Hall here. So in 1852, when this case came to court, he had just become a federal judge with the U.S. District Court in Buffalo. And he was appointed by President Millard Fillmore, who, whenever you see a list of top 10 worst presidents, he's always in that list. But nevertheless, he was appointed. So what did he do for a job right before he was appointed? He was appointed pretty much at the same time the accident happened. Oh, from 1850 to 1852, he was Postmaster General of the United States. Now the mail argument suddenly makes a lot more sense. He was postmaster. In fact, it's not quite clear. He might have still been postmaster while hearing the case, because he resigned roughly around the time that the proceedings were going on. Maybe that's why the railroad thought they could do something with that. And this guy was no slouch. He was a political insider. I mean, this guy had many social and political connections with the wealthy and powerful, including people that ran railroads. All the players, the lawyers, everybody. He was a established part of the system. He was no idiot. He was deputy clerk of Erie County, clerk of Board of Supervisors, member of the Aldermen of Buffalo. He was judge in the court of Erie County. He was elected to the New York State Assembly, and he even went to Congress as a Whig, one of those last political parties that existed before Democrat and Republican. He was no political slouch. And so maybe they thought or hoped that they could railroad him through this. Because he certainly could be subject to influence. I mean, he was around it pretty much his entire career. Nevertheless, he made the right decision. And he went on to actually serve with distinction. So he actually served 24 years as a federal judge. And he was the judge on the Susan B. Anthony trial. That's kind of cool. He was very good friends with President Fillmore, by the way, who had appointed him first Postmaster General in 1850, when Fillmore went to office. And then when it was, he came in halfway. And that was obvious that he wasn't going to even try to run for re-election or get re-elected in 1852. He quickly appointed him a federal judge. And that's how he ended up being a judge. And these two actually had an even closer tie. These two died within 6 days of each other. So, boy, talk about close friends, huh? And they're even buried in the same graveyard in Buffalo, New York. So these two really were well connected to each other. Why might that be? Well, let's look at Fillmore. So this is President Fillmore, 13th president, lucky 13. Only president for 3 years, and that's because Zachary Taylor died while in office. He was the last Whig president. No more Whigs after him, pretty much. Nathan Hall, the judge, studied law under him in Buffalo. In fact, he joined his practice as first a clerk and later became a full partner. So Nathan Hall and Fillmore were like this. He appointed him Postmaster General in 1850 and then the federal judge in 1852. And Fillmore was one of the important dignitaries on an inspection trip, a junket, on the New York and Erie Railroad going from Piermont to Dunkirk when that final spur was connected the prior year in 1851. So you can kind of see the connections, the politics. The railroads ran everything, not just the railroads, but the politics of the day. They were power, they were influential, and all this was wrapped up, and the poor little Plymouth got in the way. And that's how the Plymouth ended up at the bottom of Lake Erie, is because of all of this. So it's a really cool story. I mean, shipwrecks are not just the shipwreck. They're tied to the time period that they're in and all the connections of what was going on around them at the time. And that kind of brings us full circle back. So what got us started in the project was the buried schooner. Here's some images of the buried schooner. And we can now say that it's not the Plymouth. So we could probably say it's not the Mackinaw, because it's about 20, 25 miles out as well. So then what is it? Well, that's a good question. We don't know. More work is needed. And our suspicions are this is a very old wreck. Actually, potentially a very significant wreck. But we're going to have to try something else to figure that out. So thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them. Yes.
How many shipwrecks are in Lake Erie?
Nobody knows the answer to that question. So the question is, how many shipwrecks are there in Lake Erie? Or even the Great Lakes? Nobody knows the answer because nobody knows how many ships are out there. Nobody kept good records for quite a bit of time. Even when they did, different government agencies would be keeping different records at different times. And you got to remember there's two governments, Canadian and American. In a lot of cases, you know a ship is out there simply because of a newspaper article, either from the paper that the ship sailed from, that had people that lived there, or was right offshore when the ship sank and debris and bodies and things came ashore for survivors. Sometimes that's the only recording of the ship going down. I will also point out that ships usually sank 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times in their lifetime. These are money makers. These are vessels of commerce. And if it's sitting on the bottom in 15 feet of water, if the owner doesn't pump it out, pay a salvage company to raise it and put it back into service, the insurance company will. It's cheaper than building a whole new ship. And so these things are often sunk. And the sinkings made the news, but the raisings not so much. You might see a little paragraph in a local paper a year later, 6 months later, 2 years later, saying they raised it and put it back in service. Sometimes looking at the enrollment ships, you'll figure out, oh, it's back in service again. But sometimes they change the name. Hard to follow. So it's really tough to say how many are out there. Even if you know the number that it sank, which we don't, you don't know how many were left there.
Right.
So in the end, it's a real guess. The best guess is somewhere between 500 and 2,000 ships in Lake Erie, which is not bad. Lake Erie is 10,000 square miles roughly, which means that's a shipwreck one every 20 miles, 20 square miles. That's actually not bad. That's actually one of the most densest shipwreck bodies out there for a body of water that size. So it's a lot. And in the Great Lakes in general, even though you didn't ask that, the number varies from 3,000 to 5,000 total. But again, nobody really knows the answer.
Say for this ship, is there anything, what can be salvaged, if anything?
So the question is, what could be salvaged from this wreck? Nothing. First of all, it's owned by the state of Ohio.
Okay.
It is public territory, and it's just like going to a state park. You can't just start digging and take something. Especially battlefields, they'd be really upset with that. Even though nobody died on the ship, some of these ships did have people die. And so I look at them very much like a Civil War battlefield, where you don't go disturbing things, you don't take things. Now, it was completely illegal to take anything you wanted through the 1960s, 70s, 80s, up until the 90s. And then people got tired of diving stripped ships. And the diver community started asking for protections. And first Canada, then the United States, eventually actually protected its entire bottomlands. You're not allowed to take anything without a permit. archaeological survey, license, conservation plan, and the money up front to conserve it. So it's very, very tough to raise something. Best thing to do is leave them. So the Great Lakes are cold, fresh water. You notice I showed you a beautiful wooden ship that sank in 1852. Did it look like it sank in 1852? No, it looked gorgeous, didn't it? Maybe it sank 30 years ago. The Great Lakes are some of the best shipwrecks in the world because it's cold, fresh water. That means there's no teredo worms, which eat ships, shipworms. Even the Titanic, 3-4 miles of water, every scrap of organic material is gone. You've seen this picture of the 2 boots. Well, there was a person in those boots on the bottom of the Titanic. Benches sitting there. The metal parts are there. The wood slats are completely gone. The round staircase, if it didn't blow out in the sinking, was completely eaten away. You don't have that in the Great Lakes. Wood preserves for hundreds of years. And it's fresh water. Metal doesn't rust like it does in the ocean. Salt water is very corrosive. And in fact, salt water is corrosive for other reasons. There's bacteria in salt water that eat metal. Everyone see those rust sickles off the Titanic and other ships? Yep. That's bacteria eating the steel. They're eating 100 pounds a day. And that ship will be gone in several hundred years, even though it's huge. Because it'll be a big pile of rust on the bottom because that's what oceans do. The only way you can really preserve ships in the ocean is get them buried. Or sink in brackish water like the Baltic Sea. Then there's a chance of good preservation. So the Great Lakes are really unique. I've seen original paint on ships that sank in 1852. It's a side paddle wheel steamer up in Lake Erie called the Comet, or the Detroit. And it painted green and white, because I can see the green and white paint. You know, it sank in 1854. You can't see that anywhere else in the world. That's what makes the Great Lakes unique. Yes?
The Edmund Fitzgerald, now, can you dive that, or is it too deep, or if it's
yes
too deep?
And yes.
If it's too deep, why can they go to the Titanic and they can't go to this one?
Okay, so the Edmund Fitzgerald. The Edmund Fitzgerald is kind of a special case. So the Fitzgerald is in 500 feet of water in Lake Superior, not Lake Erie. I don't know where people get that idea. Lake Erie is only 210 feet deep, so you'd have to dig a hole to get to 500. That is the most recent large ship to have sank with loss of life. 29 people died on that vessel. Their families are still alive. And so it's in Canadian waters, and the Canadian passed a law saying you are not allowed to dive it, you are not allowed to image it, you can't even drag a side scan sonar past it. And that's due to the wishes of the families. A lot of these other vessels have no living relatives, or very distantly. And so it's a little different of a situation. But the Edmund Fitzgerald was dove back before that law by 2 guys that were absolutely insane because they had to use very special, remember I said I'm a technical diver? And I feel very comfortable at 200 feet, but my limit's about 250, maybe 300. And that's going to mean spending for 20 minutes on the bottom, probably 3 or 4 hours in 38-degree water. Those 2 guys that dove the Edmund Fitzgerald back in the early, mid-90s spent 5 minutes on the bridge and spent 6 hours in 38-degree water slowly decompressing out. That's why you can't dive, for 2 reasons. 1, it's illegal now. 2, it's crazy to even attempt it. You need a submersible. And in fact, the pictures you see of the Edmund Fitzgerald was taken from submersibles back when it was legal. Now it's even illegal for them to do it. So nobody goes near it. And it's probably because they did find a body laying on the bottom next to the ship. And they took photos, and that really upset people. So that's why that law exists. Yes?
You talk about what the bottom of the lake is like, and that mystery schooner is mostly buried and barely visible, but the Plymouth is very much visible.
So the question is, can I describe the bottom of Lake Erie? What does it look like? So the bottom of Lake Erie, think of it as flat mud for as far as you can see. Makes searching very easy, by the way, because anything that sticks up is probably a shipwreck, or a log, or a fishing net. So the mud is from Lake Erie, of course, is a glacial lake, scoured out by the glaciers roughly 14,000 years ago, and then the glaciers retreated. And when they did, they left behind a lot of what's called alluvial till, which is gravel and rock all ground up from the glacier. And of course, the ice doesn't take it with it. It melts and they just drop out. And then of course, the melting ice carves little rivers and channels and things like that. So in some place, all that mud that came in in the last 10,000 years from rivers and things discharging into Lake Erie and things settling out. It's relatively geologically young, less than 5,000 years old for most of it. And because of that, it's very soft. But depending on what, it makes the lake very flat on the bottom. There's almost no topography except for around the islands and around Long Point and a few other places. But right under that mud, in some places, there's only a few inches and you hit that alluvial tilt, which to me is a hard bottom. It's not bedrock, but you're not getting through it. The ship will just rest on it perfectly fine. Other parts, we have one ship that is completely gone. We know it's there. We can see it on our magnetometers. We used a sub-bottom profiler to image it. It was almost a 300-foot long vessel, just like the Northern Indiana, completely gone. It's under 15 feet of silt to the deck. And it's another 15 feet to the bottom of wherever it's sitting on. That's 30 to 40 foot of silt. So depending on where you sink, some of these ships stand high off the bottom. Others are sinking in, are almost gone, or completely gone, which is unfortunate because I really like to see shipwrecks, and I hate it when they get buried. And it's a problem that's actually being accelerated by zebra mussels, quagga mussels. Their poop is burying things.
Wow.
And we're noticing wrecks that were always exposed are now going under because they're actually accumulating around them. So that's the lake bottom, and sometimes shipwrecks are great. Sometimes, like the buried schooner, they're almost gone. One of my worries is one of these days it will be gone, which would be unfortunate because I think it's a very cool wreck. We've talked about ideas of what we can do to survey it, even though we can't see it. We haven't gone and done it yet.
What's the 300-footer that disappeared that you mentioned?
It's called the Lockwood, the CB Lockwood. Sank 1902. It was the largest wooden steamer built in Cleveland at the time. 285 foot long, 40 foot beam, triple expansion engine, which stands 20 feet tall, 3 boilers, 12 foot in diameter, and carrying flaxseed. Sank. It was surveyed at the time it sank. We have exact positions from 2 different government survey vessels, from the Hydrological Office and the Corps of Engineers. We have magnetometer hits, and we have a sub-bottom profiler. It shows a large cigar-shaped object there, but it's gone. And that's unfortunate, because there's other ships out there that are 300 foot long that everybody's looking for that may not be found because they're under the lake bottom. We don't know.
No.
Yes?
On most of the dives that you've been making on these shipwrecks, are you diving with compressed air or are you going mixed gas?
So the question is, what do we use for breathing? You obviously know a little bit about diving. You can ask that question. Most of our dives in Lake Erie, especially off of Cleveland, are all on air. One of the things, by the way, one of my pet peeves is when you read a newspaper article, you say the diver's oxygen ran out. We're not breathing oxygen, we're breathing air. Yes, there's 21% oxygen in it, but no, it's air. Having said that, when you get to the eastern basin of Lake Erie and you get beyond the recreational depth of about 130 foot, you want to switch to something called trimix. That's got helium in it. So air has nitrogen. That's what gives you the bends. It's also narcotic. And beyond about 100 foot, you start to think a little funny. And at 150 foot on air, you may not remember the dive, and you're doing silly things, and you're a little loopy. They call it Martini's Law. Cousteau called it rapture of the deep. And so you want to switch to helium. You cut some of the nitrogen out and put helium in its place.
Yeah, the old adage on diving air from what I wrote some number of years back is the deeper you go, the higher you get.
Yes, absolutely true. I actually have one dive I do not remember on air. It was 145 foot. I remember going down, and I remember 15 minutes going by, and I'm hanging on the line going, how did I get here? And I have little flash memories of the dive, but that's it. That's what convinced me I need to do helium. Because I like to remember my dives, and it's very unsafe not to know what you're doing. So yes.
On this one particular wreck that you did all the research, about how many dives did you guys make doing all the research dives on it?
For the Plymouth?
The Plymouth.
So for the Plymouth, we did 3 survey dives. Or I should say 6 dives, because we did 3 trips out, 2 dives. It's at 75 foot, and so you can just about put 40 minutes in, and we dive aluminum 80s generally. And so you're going to be drained on your air, and you're just hitting decompression. So everything says get out of the water after about 35 minutes, and another 5 minutes up, do as long as safety stop, 5-10 minutes, and then get out. So it was usually 2 dives in 3 trips. So all that information, the photos, and the survey stuff is all done in that time period.
What's your visibility down there?
Question is, what's the visibility down there? So some of those photos, they were taken, we went back because we wanted to get better photos. A lot of our surveying was done in just 3 to 5 foot of visibility, which is not unusual. As long as I have arm's length, I'm happy. But to get good photos, you need better visibility. And that's actually we went out in the spring of the following year, was to get better photos. And Cindy and I spent our time getting a few measurements, and then we rescued a bunch of perch out of some trapped nets. They're still alive in the nets, the ghost nets, and so we spent our time cutting them out and freeing them. In that trip, we had about 15 foot of visibility, which is good. I have seen as much as 35 foot of visibility off of Cleveland on rare days. I really appreciate those days. If you go east, average visibility off of like Erie, PA, Long Point, 30 to 50 foot. I've seen well over 100 foot. I've seen whole schooners from bow to stern on the eastern basin of Lake Erie. And in other Great Lakes where they're all routinely 50 to 100 foot of visibility now.
One other question, how many members are in the Cleveland Underwater Explorers? Roughly, how many members are in the group?
So for the core group, we roughly have 6 people. Myself, Dave, Jim Pasker, Tom Kowalczyk, Cindy, and Rob Richmond.
Okay, just curious.
And then we have peripheral people that help survey and sometimes. So how many people would love to go search for a shipwreck? Just 1, 2, okay. Most people are like, oh yeah, I want to go look for shipwrecks. And that's great for the first hour on the boat. After hour 6, 7, 8, it's getting a little boring. You're swatting flies, you're hot, you're tired, you're staring at a screen in bright sunlight all day, and you do this trip after trip after trip after trip. Sometimes it takes years to find a ship. It took us 4 years to find the Riverside, one of the ships that we found. And that's 25 miles out, and it takes an hour and a half just to get sight. You need perfect weather. If you're lucky, it takes 3 hours to do a single square mile, and that's looking out 600 foot aside, swath of 1,200 foot with side scan, plus pulling a magnetometer in case you run over the top of something. And even that takes 3 hours to do a single square mile. So we searched almost 25 square miles to find the Riverside. Do the math. After that, it gets really hard to find people who want to sit on a boat for that long doing it. So we have people that do like doing that, and some of our divers, and they'll help us survey as well. But core group says 6 people. We're small, and we're nonprofit, which means we spend money on it, we don't make money on it. In the back.
Has your group published your research and findings, or is everything online?
So we actually do publish. Remember I said that Dave is an archaeologist, and so we have, I'd say, about half a dozen to a dozen articles now in the Society of Historical Archaeology. Dave used to regularly, in fact, go to the SHA conferences, give a presentation, and then we'd publish in the proceedings for that. So we've published most of our major findings in that. We also publish in the inland seas. We're admittedly, that's the journal for the Great Lakes Historical Society, now called the National Museum of the Great Lakes when they moved to Toledo. But they still have their wonderful, if you don't get it, you're really interested in maritime history of the Great Lakes, I strongly recommend getting signed up as a member of the GLHS, National Museum of the Great Lakes. And part of your membership is you get the Inland Seas. It's a quarterly journal. We've published in there as well. And it has wonderful stuff in it from all over the Great Lakes. If you're a boat nerd, it's a must-have.
How many major finds have you been able to locate over the number of years?
So the question is, how many major finds? So the very first one we found was the Cortland. That was one that people looked for 30 years, and we found that one. Barkentine off of Lorraine. We found Barge F, which is our deepest one in the eastern basin. We found the one that's given us a lot of publicity is the Anthony Wayne, a side paddle wheeler that went down in 1849 off of Vermilion. We found the Riverside. We have found the Sultan. I think a lot of people have heard about the Sultan off of Euclid. In fact, I've talked about it here. We have found the Margaret Olwell. We found the Argo, which is a fuel barge that went down in 1937. Top environmental hazard of Lake Erie, which I will be talking here on, by the way, next year. So I forget the date off the top of my head, but I'm going to say March 15th. I think it's March 15th.
You know, for not knowing the date, you sure knew the date.
Yeah, it's just off of memory.
So remember the Ides of March.
Yeah, the Ides of March. Always a good time to talk about top environmental threats.
A lot of research, but some nice major finds.
Yes, yes. And so when you look for shipwrecks, you don't just go out and look. There's a lot of water out there. You're not going to find it. Now, admittedly, the buried schooner we found when we were looking for the riverside. You always find something. You're looking for something else, you find something else. The Tom's wrecked the Argo. He's actually looking for another ship when he found that. The Lake Serpent, same thing. He's actually looking for another ship when he found that. So you do find other things. But really, when you do shipwreck hunting, you need to spend your winters researching. Archives. Get as much information to narrow it down as much as you can. And then you go to search, and hopefully you're a little lucky. Yes?
I was just going to ask you, you mentioned you know about 40 documented wrecks that you found, and that there's hundreds that are undiscovered and that. Do you ever get tips from the number of fishermen that have some high-tech sonars that will possibly give you longitude, latitude, something they run over?
So the question is, as part of our research, do we get tips from people that are out there that run over things? Fishermen in particular cover a lot of water, and we have tried that in the past. It doesn't work out so well because fishermen and GPS apparently don't go together. They give us numbers of things, of known snags where they lose lures. We'll go out and there is nothing for a mile around the coordinates, nothing at all. They probably thought to look at the GPS an hour later or something. We've tried that route. Maybe with the advent of Humminbird bottom sounders, which are little side scans that actually show you a picture of the bottom very locally, maybe that will improve those odds. And we have chased coordinates in the past. It's never been successful though, which is surprising because other shipwrecks have been found by people running over them by accident that weren't divers, usually losing something on it, an anchor or fishing line or something. But in our case, we've never had a single success with that approach. Yes?
Yeah, I was wondering, there's a lot of aircraft that have gone down that lake too. Just a few years ago, a small passenger jet
Yep.
went down out of Cleveland.
Yeah.
You guys ever run into any aircraft?
So the question is, have we found aircraft? The answer is no, for two reasons. One, modern aircraft, when they crash, they do almost 100% recovery as part of the accident investigation. So that small jet you mentioned that crashed a couple of years ago from that family coming home from a Cavaliers game, I know exactly where that plane went down, and I've dove that area. There's not a scrap of anything to be found. It's actually near one of the wrecks we found. We call it the CSU wreck. And the reason for that is they did most of the recovery. They recovered everything that was worth recovering. Now that leads me to the second thing. So when an airplane crashes, unlike the movies where you find a perfectly preserved aircraft on the bottom, that's not what happens. When airplanes hit water, it's like tissue paper sliding across sandpaper or hitting a rock. Airplanes shatter into thousands of little pieces of aluminum not bigger than this. Mostly on an airplane accident, what you are going to find is only a few things. The engines, which usually hold together, the center box, where all the wings and the fuselage come together, that's a structurally enough piece, and you'll find maybe a big portion of that, a few feet. And then, of course, the tail, which is usually the last thing to hit. The airplane's slowed down enough, the tail might hold together. That's about all you're going to find of an airplane. And those big parts are very quickly recovered in accident investigations. We've never ran across any other airplane that went down out there that nobody, wasn't a big accident like a Cessna or something. And one of the reasons for that is it's a small target. Remember, we're looking for schooners that are 100 foot long. We're looking out 600 feet. It would appear to be just a speck on our screen. Probably not even worth investigating. In order to find targets like that, you're going to pull the range in, which means you take a lot longer to search a particular piece of water. And unless you're purposely looking for something like that, you're not going to pull the range in. So even if we ran past one, I'm not sure we'd recognize it. It'd have to be the perfect angle where it's like a little X and maybe the person bellied it in somehow and held together. But we've never had that happen to us. I would love to find one though, don't get me wrong. I love airplanes. Yes?
Yeah, just another quick question. I know the salvage laws and the archaeological laws prevent somebody from taking anything off of a ship, for some time now. What any historical artifacts that aren't associated with a wreck, are those able to be recovered? Bottles, maybe an anchor?
So that's a gray area. So the question is so there's things in the lake bottom, bottles thrown overboard, garbage. They used to dump all of Cleveland's garbage out there. And there are certain areas we search that we can't search because it's just debris everywhere. Bricks, boards, garbage. What are the laws on bringing that stuff up? Kind of a gray area. So a lot of people dive rivers to collect bottles and things like that, coins, all sorts of things like that. If you talk to the archaeologists and the lawyers, it is definitely off limits because it's still part of the bottomlands. They're embedded in the bottomlands. They're protected, regardless of association with a shipwreck or not. But at the same time, I know there are people out there that do that regularly, and it doesn't seem to be a problem. And for people that are into shipwrecks and archaeology, I mean, I can certainly understand, the fact that it's not really connected with the shipwreck, and it's just going to sit in the bottom otherwise. But it's one of those things that highly debated. Can't really give you an answer whether it's legal or not. Probably not, but it doesn't mean that people aren't doing it. Now, don't take anything off a shipwreck. People will be all over you. There's been cases where somebody's taken something and the local diver community made them put it back. So, any other questions? Yes?
Could it be possible that the ship that wrecked, could it be possible it's an older model than 1850?
Oh, are there older ships out there than 1850?
Yeah, I mean, could it be like something that's more older? Because I mean, I know that sometimes people had outdated ships doing cargo, stuff like that.
Yeah, so there are older ships. Remember I mentioned the Lake Serpent earlier. That is an earlier ship. In fact, the earliest known commercial cargo ship in Lake Erie. It's 1829. I think built 1825, sank 1829. I'm going off the memory, don't quote me on that.
Well, yeah,
But that's
because I mean,
certainly
they
earlier.
have outdated stuff from Pilgrim era.
Right, and in fact, there are
are
shipwrecks in the Great Lakes that date from the 1700s,
Yeah.
especially Lake Ontario, where a lot of activity happened before the Welland Canal and everything moved to the upper lakes. And even in Lake Erie, there may be a sloop out there, a single-masted day sailing vessel. One would be the Beaver that dates to very early 1800s, but it wrecked on shore, so if there's anything left of it, it's a piece of wood that would be unidentifiable. But there are ships that might be out there. Like I said, it's really hard to know what's out there, especially that early when there weren't even local papers, because at the time this was frontier country. And if that ship went down, there was no local newspaper to record it sinking. So it's possible. And there's a couple shipwrecks I suspect that are unidentified that are actually very old shipwrecks, but we just don't have enough to ID them. And so there are earlier ships out there. One we found, and there's more, probably even earlier, because these lakes have been sailed since the 1700s.
I just got a quick question.
Yeah.
Now, the ship that wrecked in front of Willowick or Willoughby,
Oh, yes.
that one, now it was burning out there. So when it's burning and it's sinking, is there anything left then when it sinks to the bottom, or?
So the question is, what you're talking about is a ship called the J.P. Griffith.
Yes.
There's a big side paddle wheeler that caught fire and grounded on shore just off of Euclid Beach area and burned to the waterline. Tragically, a lot of people couldn't swim. They all drowned. The survivors were like 10 or 20 at most, out of hundreds of people. At the time, it was the greatest Great Lakes disaster and loss of life. What happens to a ship like that is typically when it grounds, it burns to the waterline. And in fact, people aren't aware of it, but there were divers back then. And there are accounts of early divers, Johnny Green in particular, actually diving that wreck and bringing up bodies, recovered equipment, things like that. They actually raised the hull, took it ashore at Grand River, took all the equipment off of it, and took the hull out into the lake and scuttled it. As far as I know, nobody's found that scuttled hull, but the bottom part of the ship would still have been there. That was actually raised just so they could easier get the equipment off, the engines to reuse and all that, and then they took it out and sank it somewhere. And they didn't say where, and like I said, I don't know anybody's found it. But it's out there somewhere. So that's typically what's left. But here's the other thing too. So whenever somebody says there's gold on a ship out there, you have to remember somebody on shore is missing their gold. And there were divers then. and these ships had the mast stick out of the water. They would have gone out and gotten it. The Anthony Wayne were the side paddle wheelers that Tom Kwalczyk found off of Vermilion. It's only in 40 feet of water, and they were divers then. And there was always this gold treasure in the safe. Trust me, if there's gold, the owners would have sent somebody out to get it. So no, and even ships like the Plymouth, it's a famous copper. The most valuable thing you're going to find is copper. The Plymouth was carrying copper ingots, sank off of Thunder Bay in 270 feet of water, and it was salvaged. They got every last scrap of copper from the mid to late 1800s all the way through the early 1900s. Clamshells, divers, everything. They got it. So you have to remember, anything out there would be raised, salvaged, if it was worth anything. And if it wasn't, it's just sitting there in whatever state it was left in. All right, thank you very much.